We're going to Garry Kasparov and Mikhail Tal's game in 1983. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, c6, semi-Slav defense. In this defense, the center d5 pawn is heavily supported by other pawns, so that the pieces can be actively and freely developed. For the time being, everything is calm, but if Kasparov and Tal are present, it won't be long. Kasparov continued with bishop g5. It's the most aggressive move against a semi-Slav defense. There are, of course, systems in which the bishop is kept inside. But Kasparov preferred the idea of getting the bishop out first if he makes an e3 move in the future. In addition, because the bishop is in pin, he can advance e4 much more effectively in the future than the center. Alright, with the d takes c4 move, Tal is attempting to create an imbalance in the position. Are we surprised? No. Kasparov says, now that you've given up your center pawn, I'll play the e4 move and take the center. I want my pawn back and I have an e5 threat to take advantage of the pin. Come on now, do your best. What do you believe Mikhail Tal's response was? He says, I'm not interested in advancing e5. I've taken c4, so I'll continue to guard my pawn. b5, Botvinnik variation. It's a complicated variant. First of all, guys, hear this. Mikhail Tal says, now that I left the center to my opponent in this way, then I have to explain it to myself in a logical way. So there has to be an advantage here. We can explain that as his extra pawn. And we have a better understanding of another function of the c6 move that was just made. Now, after b5, well, there's an important question here. Wouldn't he lose his knight against e5? No. Tal continues the game with h6 by counterattacking and claiming that everything is under control. Of course, Kasparov advanced the bishop h4, and once again, the g5 is mandatory. Garry Kasparov, on the other hand, had no intention of quietly backing away his bishop. He continues the game with knight takes g5 move, and we can say that the game has gone wild in the opening. Tal plays an important role in this. I mean, I'm starting to get a little scared. This knight sacrifice is not a good sign. Let's see. Knight takes g5, h takes g5, bishop takes g5. Of course, it was a temporary sacrifice, because Kasparov will take the piece back in a moment. Also, because the bishop's f6 move poses a double threat, Tal must deal with it. Here, knight b to d7. Now, Kasparov has taken back his piece with the e takes e6 move, allowing a pawn in his own center to move towards the king side. We'll see if that's an advantage or a disadvantage. Bishop b7. It was possibly the most powerful and logical square Tal's bishop could develop. Garry Kasparov is also aware of the strong potential of the opposing bishop in this cross and has no intention of leaving it alone. In response, he prepares his own king's bishop to develop from a long cross, g3. With c5, Tal has increased the pressure on the center and wants the rook by clearing the way. And here, you have to close that cross. Therefore, we can say that d5 is mandatory. And now, after d5, we can say that this is a significant parting of ways for Mikhail Tal. Here, of course, knight takes f6 move can be made. But there's a bit of a frustrating pin after knight takes f6. This may not be a major issue in and of itself. but you must act quickly to allow the bishop to get out of the pin. There is that. That's why, against d5, Mikhail Tal didn't take this pawn here. He continued with queen b6. So, while defending the pawn in b5, he's getting ready for the queenside castling. Because it appears that the center is about to open gradually, and Tal's king will not feel safe or comfortable there. It's also worth noting that the queen is located in the 6th horizontal, because at this point, if d takes e6, this looks pretty good, doesn't it? Now, we want checkmate in one move. However, because the queen is on the 6th horizontal, it leads to the queen takes e6 move. That's why it was important. You'd move with the king's tempo and soon realize the rook had been lost. That is why, after queen b6, Kasparov does not take e6. Bishop has completed its kingside castling preparations with g2. Now queenside castling and kingside castling. Both great masters perform castling on the opposite wing. And in these situations, what do we know so well? Both great masters will execute an offensive strategy against the other's king. I'd like to discuss the basic ideas and strategies of Botvinnik variation, as well as plans that both great masters can put into action. First, castlings were performed on opposite wings. We couldn't have expected Tal to perform a kingside castling anyway. That would not be safe at all. And, as you may recall, Kasparov just took the h and g pawns with the knight g5 sacrifice. Mikhail Tal can also try to take advantage of the open verticals and lack of pawns to make it easier for him to reach the opposing king. He's got that advantage. Of course, Garry Kasparov will also try to reach the opposing king. It's fair to say that Tal's plan A is to attack Kasparov's king, but that isn't his only plan. There is, in fact, a plan B. And plan B can sometimes get in the way of plan A. What's that mean? Mikhail Tal might be able to form a passing pawn from the queen side with this swarm of pawns on the queen side. He's got that advantage. However, if we talk about a weakness in this plan, the fact that the pawns in the front of the king have advanced too far may indicate that Tal's king is also weakened. It's very important. While Garry Kasparov is attempting to reach Tal's king in order to exploit these pawns' weaknesses, keep in mind that he also has a far-passed pawn. Kasparov can also try to create a far-passed pawn if the conditions are favorable and he feels secure. So the Botvinnik variant is quite complicated, and we're not talking about a single plan here. It's a path with a lot of options. Alright, Kasparov made a kingside castling, and Mikhail Tal continued the game with b4. If these pawns advance, they may pose a serious threat. Of course, after b4, we can discuss the pawn's sensitivity in the d5 square. And in fact, this b4 advance is a particular concern to center, because the knight has to get away from the center. In this variant, however, the knight can perform important things in the a4 square. First, he demanded the queen with tempo, when Tal responds this with b5. Yes, there's no more pin, and maybe the e6 pawn can be taken. However, because the opponent's queen and rook are facing each other, we can say that Mikhail Tal would be more prepared for the d vertical opening. Furthermore, following the bishop exchange, the white squares surrounding Garry Kasparov's king will be extremely weak. As a result, these exchanges, as well as the d vertical that opens up, would clearly benefit Tal more. That's why Kasparov didn't take e6, and he continued with a3 after queen b5. Now the idea is clear. As I previously stated, advancing pawns weaken the opposing king. In this position, Kasparov will take the b4 pawn and try to open the a vertical in order to reach the opposing king. That's why he made the a3 move, and here comes the knight b8 move from Mikhail Tal. Although it may not appear pleasant to see the knight move backwards near the board's corner, the d5 pawn is now in pin, and it appears unlikely that this pawn will be protected at this point. Knight b8. Kasparov took b4 and opened vertical a. And after c takes b4, of course, it's fair to say that we can say that he has the potential to create a passing pawn in this situation. However, as previously stated, it will significantly weaken the king because of the pawn's placement. Creating a passing pawn, on the other hand, can give you more flexibility in your strategy. There's also the possibility of exchanging the queen to feel the pressure directed at your king and the power of the passing pawns more strongly at the end of the game. This means that, while it comes with risks, it also has the potential to provide you with more flexible plan options. Against the c takes b4 move, Kasparov made sure the bishop in g5 faces at the a7 with the bishop e3 move, because the bishop in g5 appears to be a bit pointless. And after bishop e3, bishop takes d5. There's not much we can do because the pawn in d5 was in a pin, and he was going to lose that piece anyway. Bishop takes d5, rook takes d5. After queen e2, he has played knight c6 to protect the pawn in a7. And against that move, Garry Kasparov played rook f to c1. He says, "Give me your c4 pawn." Tal, on the other hand, does not take such a passive defense. He centered his knight with knight e5 while protecting the pawn. Now Kasparov needs to hurry. Otherwise, if this knight manages to develop its position from square d3, achieving anything will be extremely difficult. That's why Kasparov immediately played b3. Let's not forget that the c4 pawn is in the open, and now we want to take it. There's not much that can be done. Tal played c3. Do you think Kasparov's b3 move was a mistake? Because it looks like Tal was able to keep the c vertical closed and create an en passant. But Garry Kasparov says, the knights in the corner of the board aren't always bad. He's acting like Tal with the knight takes c3 move. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, rook takes c3. Here we can understand the weakness of the advancing pawn. Now Mikhail Tal has played king b8. Kasparov is checking up on his opponent with queen c2, because at this point, rook c8 and then queen c7. The bishop d6 move was required because he wanted checkmate in 2 moves. All right, bishop takes a7 after bishop d6, king b7, and b4 move from Garry Kasparov. What does the b4 move want now? Rook a5. This can be a little frustrating, and of course, the b4 pawn can't be taken for tactical reasons. If you take it with the queen, the rook b3 move will cost you the queen. If you take it with the bishop, keep in mind that this bishop had to protect the c7, which could quickly end the game. That's why Tal played knight c6 against b4, so that he could block the rook a5 and demand the bishop. When Kasparov moves his bishop back to e3, Tal takes advantage of the situation with the bishop e5. He demanded both rooks. What can be done? Garry Kasparov made a sacrifice with queen takes c6 move, but this rook cannot be taken, because if the queen takes c6, the rook a7 will check, and the queen will fall because the king will be unable to protect it. For this reason, against the rook takes c6 move, yes, the rook cannot be taken. However, the other rook can be taken with the bishop takes a1 move. That's what Tal did, and now rook c7. Yes, I did just say that rook c7 would end the game, but remember, there was a rook in a1. Since it no longer exists, rook c7 doesn't end the game. Garry Kasparov played bishop a7 against king b8, and bishop e3 against king a8. Now, what does he want? He wants queen a2, king, and then mate from a7 square. Well, here's the question you should be thinking of. If this idea is so effective, you should ask the question of why Kasparov did not play queen a2 without making the bishop e3 move, because it appears that he was after the bishop and there are threats from the king. He wants checkmate. But keep in mind that after the queen a2 move, the queen will lose control of the d1 square, and rook d1, king d2, and after rook takes h2, Garry Kasparov could be checkmated. We need to be careful with these. That is why he plays bishop e3 against king a8 in order to make the queen a2 move with the king tempo and deny his opponent time to move his rook d1. Of course, Tal is aware of that and immediately played king b8 to escape the queen a2 tempo. With the bishop a7 and the king a8, I'm wondering if the game will end in a draw with repetition, but Kasparov says no. He played bishop c5, and now once again, there's the threat of queen a2. If a king b8 move is made in response to this move, the rook takes f7. Guys, beware. Garry Kasparov is playing one rook behind, but he is putting a lot of pressure on Mikhail Tal's king. And he has a lot of pawns. These are very valuable. He's got 4 passing pawns. 5, in fact. Alright, what could Kasparov want with rook takes f7 move? He'll make the bishop d6 move, pave the way for the queen, checkmate either from c7 or a2 to a7 if the opposing king escapes. That's why Tal played e5 right away in order to counter the bishop's d6 move. Yes, the machine says to use f4 to deflect the bishop, but it's not easy because, as we just saw in the sample variant, Tal could have played a counter move with rook d8 against d1. Even a single tempo is crucial in this situation. You may not have time to make f4. Kasparov played bishop a7, and after king a8, bishop e3. Mikhail Tal should hold a7, now that they have queen a2 and queen a7 demands, which he has done with rook d7. Let's exchange these rooks so I can win this game, says Mikhail Tal, because he has material advantage. But queen a2, king b8, bishop a7. After king takes c8, queen takes e6. Now the rook is in pin. Tal again suggested exchanging the queens with the queen d5. Kasparov, of course, won't do that and check with queen takes a6 move. The king d8 move could also be made here, according to the machine. However, after bishop b6, there were a number of critical and difficult variants to calculate. Tal didn't do that. After queen b7 and queen c4, Garry Kasparov's response was queen c7. The two great masters agreed on a draw because there would be a repetition. What a draw, right? Of course, there are a lot of options here. You could make a rook c7 move first, but that would allow the queen e6 move, which isn't very appealing. The king d8 move could also be used in this situation. That is a possibility. Mikhail Tal, on the other hand, must not have liked it in his complex calculations. Another option is to close the bishop, but that would block the queen and rook's defense coordination, block their connection, which wouldn't look good. That's why Mikhail Tal agreed to a draw here with repetition by allowing queen c7, queen a6, and queen b7. It's a really complicated game. But as the machine told us, the two great masters made no mistakes during the game. They played perfectly. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel. And click on the bell icon to stay updated with my new videos. Hope to see you in the next videos. Take care.